Today's guest, Annie Whitehead, has been investigating crimes that happened more than a millennium ago. She's the author of Murder in Anglo-Saxon England, and she joins us today to tell us about the bloody crimes of the past. Welcome to Future Imperfect. Hello and welcome to another edition of Future Imperfect with me, your host, Jason Kingsley. Lovely to have you listening to us. I have got an author with us today, Annie Whitehead. Annie, would you do us the favour of introducing yourself, please?
Yeah, sure. Hello, Jason. It's lovely to be speaking to you. So I'm an historian and an author, and I write fiction, non-fiction and short stories, which sounds like it's really wide-ranging, but all set in Anglo-Saxon England and specifically quite often in the Midlands Kingdom of Mercia. And that's what I do. So I have 4 novels, 3 non-fiction, and quite a lot of anthologies, both fiction and non-fiction. And my latest book is Murder in Anglo-Saxon England, which sounds gory, but it was actually great fun to write.
Well, that sounds really interesting. So that's a fairly narrow geographical and historical period. Is there, why this passion for the Anglo-Saxons in particular?
It's a really good question. I think it's just one of those standards, everybody's got one of those teachers that they remember. And I've always had a deep love of history. I think it goes back to when I was 8 years old and living in York, and you can't live in a place like York and not absorb the history. But I went off to uni to study history. It was a fantastic course. I did a lot of stuff on Anglo-Saxon, or as we now probably prefer to call it, early medieval history.
I'm not sure about that. I think that's less descriptive. Yeah.
Well, I always like to put that in. I think most people, certainly on this side of the pond, understand what we mean when we talk about Anglo-Saxon England. And I don't think anybody's come up with a really good alternative name for it. So that's what I stick with, the Anglo-Saxon period. And I could easily have gone down 17th century is another passion of mine, but it just boiled down to having a fantastic tutor who just brought the age completely to life for me. And I was kind of hooked from there on in. And I love them. There's something about those people that they seem so remote. They seem separated by a different language, although what we're speaking today, right now, is more based on their language than any other. But there's this kind of line drawn across history with 1066. But if you step over that line, you do find that these are real people. It's not, although Tolkien was inspired by that era, it's not all myths and dragons. They were real people. They had really interesting lives. And I just find them fascinating.
They had a particular art style as well, didn't they? I mean, there's a lot of visual elements that are quite specifically Anglo-Saxon, as I understand it. Is that correct?
Yes. Not specifically necessarily what we might think of now as English. So if you look at the artwork of, say, the Vikings, or what people tend to think of as Celtic, which is, again, I have a problem with that term. There's a lot of similarities. It's the swirling motifs with or without the Christian element. So you've got the serpent. I mean, you've only got to think of, say, the Sutton Hoo belt buckle to get a real idea of the interlocking designs, the sort of zoomorphic designs. This is an era that used to be called the Dark Ages, for goodness sake. And we have all these beautiful items of jewellery that even modern jewellers aren't sure how they managed to achieve these things. And the artwork, the illuminated manuscripts, all absolutely beautiful.
They had a wonderful way with non-literal artwork. They were very interested in very stylized figurative patterns. And do you think this reflects the way they saw the world? They were highly decorated. People think about the medieval period in its broadest sense. Often the media portrays it as sort of muddy and dull and brown. And yeah, Hollywood is quite guilty, and as is TV. Everybody was wearing studded leather. No, they weren't. But, it looks kind of interesting for modern eyes, but that isn't representative of the time, is it at all? They loved bright colours and they loved shiny things, really.
Oh, absolutely, yes. I mean, the classic thing when you think about the jewellery is, this love of garnets. I mean, it appears in so many, and not just jewellery, but obviously military bits and pieces. The Staffordshire hoard, a lot of that is, garnets are beautifully worked. And as I mentioned, the illuminated manuscripts. But yes, of course, it was a really colourful world, as you say, not at all brown and muddy. The dyes that they produced from really, really natural substances They weren't all wandering around in brown homespun. These were really vibrant colours and they loved it. And Professor John Blair has written a really interesting book about Anglo-Saxon buildings. And he said, yes, they built with wood, but there is absolutely no reason to suppose, given their jewellery and their love of coloured fabrics, no reason to suppose that these were just plain garden sheds. They would have been, highly decorated and probably hung with tapestries and embroideries and things, with carvings and painted wood. So, yeah, I think it was a really, really vibrant society. I mean, that's not to say that everybody was rich and happy, but yeah, there was definitely colour in their world, that's for sure.
That's right. I think the concept of decoration everywhere you can feasibly afford to put decoration was probably more representative of the medieval than sort of hovels covered in mud and it raining all the time. I think if we travel back in time, and see whether you agree with me, I think if we traveled back in time, we'd probably be amazed at the chaos of decoration and colour there were in some places. Obviously, people were very poor in some areas and in some parts of society. But I think if you had the money and if you had the space and the time, you'd probably paint everything as best you could. I know some of the stuff, the reconstructions in Dover Castle of later, much after the medieval period,
Yeah.
you look at them and they're painted like a kindergarten room,
Yes, you're really, really vibrantly bright
Yes.
primary colours. Yeah, and it's absolutely astounding. And I think most people get a shock because, as you say, you go and visit places. I mean, that's more difficult with Anglo-Saxon buildings because there's not a lot left. But you go and visit old buildings, castles, churches, and you get the impression that it was just plain walls.
Yes.
Well, there's a beautiful church actually in Norfolk where they've discovered paintings on the walls which they think are pre-conquest. And it's absolutely beautiful, really vibrant paintwork. There's arguments going on as to whether they, what it actually depicts. But there is no reason to suppose that these were just plain walls and plain buildings. But unfortunately, I think when TV production companies or, films use these places as locations, they have to sort of leave them as they are. So we get this idea that they all lived in the vaults under the castles. And of course, that just isn't true. But that's because that's the only bit that's left that they can film. So, yeah, I think films and TV do a great job, but they also have a lot to answer for in this regard.
So tell me a bit more about your book. So how were the Anglo-Saxons with laws and how do we know about, murder in Anglo-Saxon England?
Well, this, again, is the really interesting thing for me. I think it would probably surprise a lot of people that we actually have written law codes from the Anglo-Saxons going right back to the 7th century, round about the time that the kingdoms were becoming Christian kingdoms, or the kings certainly were. I'm not sure how much that filtered down. And they started, obviously, with Christianity comes literacy, so the laws, which were probably already in place, started to be written down. And they're really quite detailed. And we've got quite a lot of surviving examples going right through to the 11th century. We've got a few major gaps, but we've got enough to sort of work out how society was built, what the laws were, how it affected people, what the punishments were. And again, the Dark Ages, as if there's not a wealth of material. All right, there's not as much for this period as for later ones, but there's more than enough for us to go out and to build a really strong picture of what life was like and what society was like and what was expected of them.
So was society very violent? Is this what you've discovered? Were people murdering everybody left, right and centre? And what were the consequences? Could you get away with it?
Well, one thing that I actually, if I'd ever known it, I'd sort of forgotten, because I was really aware that there are quite a lot of high-profile murder cases. But the problem is that, as with all things, their tales grow in the telling. And we get sort of slightly later chronicles from the 12th, 13th century onwards that really embellish and elaborate these stories. And when you go back to the earlier sources, the reporting is a lot more sort of prosaic. But it does seem that there's a lot. But when I counted up, I could only find about 100 cases that were reported. And they do seem to fly in the face of the law because, killing is frowned upon in the laws. But what I found absolutely fascinating was it's very, very hard across all of these written laws to find a case where murder is punished by death. If you're a thief, if you're stealing something, if you are breaking into somebody's property, into their home, you're more than likely going to hang. But if you kill, you're subject to the compensation system, which is not unique to Anglo-Saxon England. And the thinking is that it probably was widespread over Germanic society. And it was a way, we think, of stopping violence escalating. And it didn't always work. And there are some spectacular cases where it really didn't work and got completely out of hand. But on the other hand, the fact that we only hear about certain cases of it getting out of hand probably means that in the main it worked. So it's a system called weregild, which is essentially man price. And if you fight, if you damage someone, if you hurt them, you have to pay a fine. And it's laid out. So there are fines for everything from a bruise right through to murder. And if you don't pay, then your kin or your lord, they're responsible. So the idea is that you don't do it, because either you're going to be out of pocket or your family is, and then your family will turn against you. But unless you violate the king's peace, or unless the king decides to get involved, if you kill someone, you're either paying a fine or you're being exiled, but you're very unlikely to hang for it. And I found that absolutely fascinating until I did a bit more digging. And it does seem that right up to Victorian society and probably beyond, we were still hanging people for theft. You know, property almost seems more valuable than human life throughout vast periods of history. So I did find that interesting.
I wonder why that is. Is that because property people didn't have nearly as much? I mean, I think these days people have got literally hundreds of items of clothing and they can't even remember what to wear. I'm sure I've got a cupboard full of clothes that I probably haven't worn for 10 years. But in those days, you just wouldn't have had so much stuff. So perhaps violating what little people had was considered to be even bigger crime, although taking their life away seems even more extreme.
It's a really interesting one. And I did have a sort of idea that it might be also economy based. There's something in the book about the coroner's office, and I can't remember the exact wording of the law, but even that was sort of brought into effect to protect the economy. The age of culpability is quite low, but it was higher in Anglo-Saxon England than it is now.
Is it? When did you start to become guilty of crimes?
So in the 10th century, King Athelstan, set the age originally at 12, and then he said in a sort of codicil to his laws that having spoken to his advisors, he was going to raise it to 15.
Oh, wow.
And when you think that even now today, the age of culpability in the UK is 10, I think it's to do with, or probably not so much now and in the introduction of the Children Act, etc., but back then, I think that children became part of the workforce and the economy at a much younger age. And so I think it's partly to do with, as you say, property is very valuable because, you know, we can just nip into the shops and buy a T-shirt for £1 or whatever. But the amount of time it took on the loom to weave the cloth that you needed for one outfit, even baking the daily bread. It wasn't really daily bread. I mean, you'll know better than I about that. But my understanding is that it was so labour intensive that unless you were very rich, you didn't get a proper risen loaf every day. It was just normal sort of flatbreads done on a griddle.
Well, yeah, and they had heavy rye breads as well, which apparently last longer. I'm not an expert on it, but yeah, there's all sorts of complexities around bread. It's not just baking bread and putting it in the oven, but even getting water. There's no running water, and I've got horses, and just carrying buckets of water is actually hard work. And horses drink a lot of water, and people drink a lot of water as well. And you've got to take it from a nice source. You can't just take it from the river, because the river might be polluted. You've got to have a well, or you've got to have a stream that you're comfortable is good for drinking. And you can tell where the water's stinky and horrible. You're not going to drink it, and you're going to run out of it too. Somebody's got to go down to the half a mile away, fill a bucket up, and bring it back.
That's it. Everyone's living very hand to mouth. Everything is hard work. And again, of course, if you've got animals and somebody's stealing them, then they're stealing your livelihood as well. So, I think everything, as you say, fewer possessions, fewer belongings, but everything you've got is for a reason. Unless you're in the very top tier of society and you actually own jewellery and trinkets and fine glassware, and they did have some beautiful pottery and glassware, but out away from the royal court, as it were. I mean, that's not really a concept in those days. Life is, I mean, I can't remember who said it. Was it Macaulay? Life was nasty, brutish, and short. That was the reality for most people.
And you lived in the outdoors as well, to a certain extent.
Yeah.
But I notice there's no concept of prison or imprisonment at all at this stage, is there? And is that purely, I would guess, because, or is there? Or is that because it's just expensive?
There is a small amount.
Right.
Expensive, but also they didn't have prisons as we would think of them today, but there are certain law codes which mention the responsibility of a lord if he catches a thief on his land, he's to hold him for a certain number of days. So we assume that they must have been holding them securely somewhere. And the idea is, rather than being imprisoned as a sentence, they're sort of being held on remand,
Right.
sort of until their trial comes around. But the onus is on the local lord to catch these thieves and contain them until justice can be dispensed. And the local lords do have the right to hang anyone that they find on their property. So there's quite a lot of local justice going on. There's no archaeological evidence of shackles or manacles, but there are literary references to people being held in chains, but nothing survived. But we know people had locks and keys. So possibly the local lord would have somewhere where he could keep somebody securely confined until they went to trial.
Or just tie them up with ropes and
Exactly.
fling them somewhere.
Whatever's to hand. Yeah.
Just look after that. But the idea of sort of locking somebody up for 2 years as punishment for a crime is just far too expensive. It just
You're either being hanged if you're important enough and you can get away with it, exile, banishment, which is an awful thing. I mean, there's some beautiful poetry that survives from the era that talks about, the wanderer, the man in exile. I mean, hearth and home was everything, and to be away from that was a really cruel punishment.
And dangerous as well, because your support structure has gone.
Has completely gone, yeah. So it's an awful thing to be banished. We have some high-profile cases of that happening. Hanging is the usual method of execution, although we do have a lot of decapitated bodies that have been unearthed as well. But the compensation system, the weregild, is the main thing. Again, it didn't always work. There's a fantastic case of a 10th century lesser nobleman who kept stealing other people's property and lands, and the king kept, insisting on the weregild.
Saying, no.
Yeah, the weregild was assigned to the king, and this went on about 3 or 4 times, and this guy took absolutely no notice. Finally had all his property confiscated. We think he got away with it because it sounds like he died of natural causes in the end. But what was really interesting for this case, I mean, I love the idea of this guy just thumbing his nose at the king and saying, yeah, right, no, I'm just going to do it again. But after he died, his widow went over to one of the parcels of land that he'd stolen, which belonged to one of his kinsmen, killed the kinsman and 15 of his companions, and nothing is mentioned of what happened to her and what her punishment was. And it just shows, to me anyway, the difference. The priority was all about this theft of the land. Nobody's so much interested in the fact that this woman then gathered her own posse and went and killed 16 people.
Interesting that a woman led that as well, because women typically are not featured heavily in a lot of the historical record. They're they are mentioned, but not as much as men.
Yeah, they tend to be mentioned in this context only when people are spreading scurrilous rumours about their involvement in a lot of the murders. So we do find, particularly the later chroniclers, blaming the king's wives in a lot of instances, or blaming the king's daughters for murders. But as I say, when you go back to the more contemporary sources, I mean, classic example, in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which is not contemporary for the 8th century, but close enough, it simply says that King Offa of Mercia had the King of East Anglia beheaded. That's literally all it says. By the time you get to the 13th century, you've got this wonderful story about how his wife decided that this visiting king needed to be got rid of, and she whispered poison into the king's ear, and the king was having none of it, but she persuaded him, and then she had her servants dig a pit so that when the visiting king was sitting above this pit, the pit collapsed, and then they killed him, and then they decapitated him, and they threw his body in the river, and she was this awful, evil woman. It's highly unlikely to be true. We actually have a letter written by a contemporary just extolling her praises. saying what a wonderful, compassionate woman she was. And this was from a guy who was lamenting that there was so much murder going on in his home kingdom up in Northumbria that it was their own fault that the Vikings had come. So he was in despair of all the lawless murder that was going on in Northumbria. So I think if the queen that he was writing about had actually been complicit in murder, I think he probably would have given her a bit of a telling off, and he didn't. But this is a difference between the contemporary sources and the later ones, because are all men, and they're all writing, most of them living in monasteries.
So they have a very different perspective on the feminine. And
yeah.
Yes.
And in this particular case, King Offa, I mean, he was not a great guy, I think that's fair to say. But one thing he did do was found the abbey at St Albans. And the monk who wrote the story about how his wife was to blame for the murder, although his name was Roger of Wendover, that's how he's known to us, he actually was a monk at St Albans. So he's not going to speak ill of the abbey's founder.
Yes, exactly. You know? There's a lot of politics completely intertwined with religion, and we always have to look at who is writing something and why. Exactly. We have to do that today. Quite frankly, modern media literacy should be, what website are you on and what's their perspective and what's their spin.
Exactly so.
But even back then, people were putting a spin on things. I want to go a little bit back to Weregild. So how much did it cost if you murdered somebody?
Oh, do you know what? I don't have the figures off the top of my head. It depends, because the whole system is based on your worth as a person.
So it scales. So if you murder somebody who's unimportant, it's cheaper.
Yeah. And going right down to the murder of a slave, because, we have to be honest, the Anglo-Saxons had slaves. Pretty much all societies at that time did. But there were different classes of slave.
Oh, interesting.
And sort of, you're not paying the Weregild to the slave or the slave's family.
Because they weren't allowed to own stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you're paying their owner, but it depends what class of slave they were. Mm-hmm. Then the Weregild of a freeman is more than a slave and less than a lord. And even the king technically had a Weregild. And if a king was killed, then Weregild should have been paid by someone. Tended not to be the case, because 9 times out of 10, the person who'd killed the king was the next king. So
I'm not going to find myself this time. Yeah. I'm above the law.
He had an accident. Yeah, we'll just leave it at that.
But can you remember, in terms of scale, was it a ruinous amount for somebody of means, or was it something they could actually afford, sort of equivalent today of, 10 grand or something, or was it, £250,000 or, I mean, can you remember vaguely anything like that?
All I can give you as an example, just because I've got the stats recently in my head, if you hurt somebody, if you damaged part of their skull, you would pay 3 shillings.
Right.
But if you damaged the whole skull, I'm not sure where the line is between damaging the whole skull and killing someone. It was 6 shillings. So that's just the injuries.
That could be several days' work.
Yeah.
Always difficult trying to work out what something's worth, because in a lot of these societies there wasn't much cash going around. In fact, in some places they sort of run out of coin at some stages. So there was a lot of barter. So I tend to try and boil it down to the work somebody could do in a day if they're reasonably skilled. And that allows us to work backwards and go, well, how much am I paid for my reasonably skilled job today? Okay, well, it's 5 days work. All right, well, that's a reasonable amount of money then. That's how I try to look at it, because bread changes in price. The cost of clothes is very variable depending on where and what they're made of and the materials and all that kind of stuff. So, yeah. Okay.
And we assume that people are able to pay, because if they weren't, then the system sort of becomes unworkable. But it isn't always paid in the form of cash.
Right.
And although it isn't mentioned, I'm going to assume that at local level, there are a lot of anti-feuding laws as well, particularly sort of 10th century and beyond, where the kings are really trying to clamp down on feuding. And the idea is to stop it getting out of hand. Although it's not mentioned, I'm quite okay with the idea that if you have injured somebody else, there are specific laws against letting other people's livestock out, knocking down their fences. The idea might be, you've damaged my livestock, I'll have some of yours. I think, we're not that far away from a barter society. And even going right up to the top, sometimes kings, as I say, technically had to pay weregild if they did wrong. And we've got a couple of high-profile cases going right back to the 7th century where kings had to pay, but they didn't pay in monetary terms. They had to give land and have abbeys and churches built
Right.
as compensation. One famous case, 7th century king of Northumbria, again, really bad lad, decided to have one of his rivals done away, not in a pitched battle, but just really sneaky, had him lured to somebody else's house who he thought was loyal. Turned out he wasn't loyal. And that should have been the end of that. But what this king didn't really think through was the fact that the lesser king that he'd just ordered murdered was actually a kinsman of his wife. And she, therefore, could demand compensation as a kinswoman of this murdered sub-king. And she did. But she arranged to have this abbey and a church built and insisted that daily prayers were said not only for her murdered kinsman, but also for her husband. I'm not sure how contrite he was, because that wasn't quite the end of his doings. But
no, I sure, I'll pay the fine, all right, whatever, and move on. But, building a structure like that is a vast amount of money today. I presume it's a vast amount of money then as well.
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking about potentially millions of quid, to build it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we get the impression that with these two cases, and the other one is even more fun because it involves how much land a deer can run round in a day.
Do tell. So this was a punishment.
So it was a lady who was Kentish in origin, but she was married to a sub-king of Mercia, and her cousin was the King of Kent at the time, and her younger brothers were still in Kent, and he murdered them. And this happens an awful lot. And again, as the kinswoman who was closest to them, she was entitled to the compensation, to the weregild. So she asked for as much land as her pet deer could run round in a day, which turned out to be substantially more than this murderous king had anticipated. So she got a lot of land, and it's Minster in Thanet in Kent, which is still a working abbey to this day.
Oh, wow.
I think I'm right in saying that it has been continuous all the way through. There's still some Anglo-Saxon brickwork which survives, which is absolutely lovely. There's various versions of this story. At one point, the king's servant was out on the course, as it were, trying to intercept this deer. And then the ground opened up and
trying to interfere with it.
Yeah.
Right.
And one of the versions of the story says that it was actually this servant that killed the brothers. So he got his just deserts. But either way, it doesn't really matter, because if it had been the servant who'd done the dirty deed, the king, as his lord, would still have been responsible for the weregild. Because that, again, is how it works. If you can't pay, or you won't pay, then your kin group or your lord are then responsible. They take on the debt.
And they would know that, so they would try to stop you doing these kind of things. I do love some of the colourful Anglo-Saxon measurements. I did some research, and there was I think it might have been Canute gave a certain amount of land on the edge of water to a monastery, and it was as far as somebody could throw an axe from a floating boat. And I just think that's just so visceral and poetic.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not 20 feet or it's not 100 feet, which is just boring and you can measure it. It's how far can you throw an axe and that kind of stuff. And it's just shows the kind of embedded poetry in some ways, the embedded interest in the society.
But also, I think, that's absolutely right. But also, it's something that everybody would understand. And the boundaries of land, everybody needs to be sure. And if you start arguing with your neighbour and saying, you've put your hedge up 2 feet within my land, that doesn't work. But if you say my land goes to where the brook runs or to the oak tree, and we see it we've got a lot of surviving charters, and a lot of them are land grants, and all the sort of preamble is written in Latin, but the actual boundaries of the land, it's all written in Old English, Anglo-Saxon, and it is literally, from the edge of the lane to the brook, to the old oak tree, to the hedge on the far side of whatever. There is a YouTube video somewhere of the great and wonderful Michael Wood actually walking the boundaries of one of these charters and following it.
Actually following. But back to murder, if I may.
Yes, you may.
Presumably people got killed and it was justified. Did you pay the weir guild if you killed somebody, even though they were attacking you, for example?
In self-defence, it's okay. Yeah.
Okay, so you would have to prove self-defence again.
Again, it's the law codes, they're promulgated by the kings and they're written by the king's scribes. What's going on out in the sticks, as it were, is a little bit more flexible, shall we say. Unfortunately, because it's out in the sticks and it's the common folk, we don't hear so much about these cases. And at the other end of the scale, we've got the really high profile cases where people are literally getting away with murder. Sometimes it's sanctioned by the kings, sometimes it's on the king's orders. And it almost becomes not so much murder as political expediency, but we've got this horrible gap between what's written, what we know of the really high profile people, and what's actually going on at ground level.
Right, of course.
We do have a few law cases. I mean, the case of the guy who kept stealing land and refusing to pay for it. He was a lesser ranking nobleman. And we do have a couple of cases where we know about them because a lord has had to write a letter explaining what one of his men has been up to. And there's one case where there is a killing involved, but there's also some other stuff mixed up in there. And there's a particular, you have to forgive me because I've never quite worked out how to pronounce this, but it's hamsochen, which is a specific crime, very, very specific, housebreaking. What we nowadays we'd call burglary.
Yes.
But that was a specific thing. And it is mentioned in a particular law case, but not much survives, unfortunately. What we've got, and it's the same pretty much throughout history, isn't it? We know a great deal about the upper echelons.
Yes.
And very little about the ordinary people who are just working the land.
I imagine there's a certain amount of expedient justice meted out when everybody gets together and goes, look, that bloke's killed that bloke. We better go and kill him.
Yeah, and that's the whole point. It's local and everyone knows everyone else and everyone knows everyone else's business. And so what we do have is a lot of reliance on what we call hearsay. But people would know. You know, they would know these local people. They're not strangers. These are not up before the beacon, a jury of 12 who've never met them before.
Yeah, you grow up with them. Like at school, you know somebody's a bit of a bully and they're going to get themselves into trouble. And lo and behold, 10 years later, they do. And everybody knew that was written on the stars. That was going to happen.
Yeah.
So it's the same back then. It was very much more local.
Yeah, there is one case where somebody was brought to trial and still had scratch marks on his face. So there's evidence that there's been a fracas, and it also tells us that, you know, in that case, they were brought to trial really quickly before the wounds had a chance to heal and disappear. So, but yeah, everybody knew. I don't think a lot of forensics needed to be sought because people would know.
Yes.
They would hear things, they would see things, there would be witnesses, and people's characters would already be formed and known about because these were very, very local communities.
And also running away wasn't really very practical because, again, you lose your support structure, you run away, and then you are a stranger wherever you've run away to.
And you are more liable to be arrested because there are laws, again, and these are very early ones, the 7th century. If you are a stranger, you have to blow a horn to announce your arrival, your presence. And if you don't, you're more than likely going to be caught and hanged because the assumption is that you're up to no good.
Right.
And that you are a thief or a would-be thief. So if you don't announce your presence when you're out on the road in a strange part of the land, you know, you're not going to get a particularly warm welcome.
They can assume the worst.
Yeah, exactly.
I wonder if that's connected to, I did a video on my YouTube channel, Modern History TV, and I did a thing on bells on horses, and beautiful sound, and you can tell how fast a horse is going by the sound of the bells. And it occurred to me that that's also a way of announcing your presence, and it's a way of saying to people, I'm not coming in stealth. I'm not sneaking
up on you.
I'm here. Look at. I mean, it sort of is a bit. I'm here. Look at me, but for your own safety, because you're sort of saying, yes, I am a stranger, and I come with no ill intent.
Yeah.
So
I mean, most people, you're walking on foot, so to suddenly see a stranger who's not obviously trading or come to help with the annual slaughter or whatever, people are going to be suspicious because they know everyone they live near. So where have they come from and why?
Yeah, and your natural reaction is, are they bringing trouble?
Mm,
Because we don't want trouble. The last thing we want is our peace disturbed.
yeah.
And yeah, and they may even speak a funny version of the language you speak, because languages shift around, don't they, as well?
Yes. I mean, I've mentioned quite a few times Old English. That's the language that the Anglo-Saxons spoke, but a completely different dialects. So, the Mercian dialect, the West Saxon dialect. Even today, there's a Northumbrian dialect,
Yes.
which is quite impenetrable if you're not used to it. So, yes, just like with nowadays, there are local variations of speech. I think they probably understand each other. And I think depending on where they lived, I mean, a lot of Mercians who live close to what we now think of as Wales, the Welsh border, they would probably be able to communicate because you had to. I mean, there's an awful lot of trade going on.
Mm.
So you would understand other people's languages. And the upper echelons, kids would have been raised by probably British, Welsh, in other words, servants and slaves. So they would probably be more multilingual than we are, which as a nation, that's actually not saying much about the English generally, is it?
Well, I've travelled around the UK quite a bit, and you have to, especially with areas where they have strong, different rhythm of speech, or they use different, I mean, different words. Fair enough, you wouldn't necessarily know what those words were. Particularly things like the name of pieces of bread.
Oh, that's a fascinating
Bread
one.
rolls, or what are,
Or a
a
cob or a
small, for
bap,
those that,
yeah.
a cob or bap, or a, there's all sorts of, and it's sort of fascinating that some of those are different, or even things like, so I grew up in Leicestershire, and very narrow streets. So we some people call them jitties, some alleys, but they're these little tiny components. You can't drive a car down them at all. They're very narrow. They're sort of narrow for one person or two people walking along them, and they've got different names in lots of different parts of the country of really geographically a small place like the British Isles. I find that fascinating. I've got some builders working with me, and they're from the northwest of the country, and when they're talking to each other, their accents shift to a more extreme. I think it's a more extreme version of the way they speak when they're talking to me. And I find that absolutely wonderful. And they're going, well, we've got really strong accents. And no, you've got brilliant accents. I've got a strong accent too. It's just that my accent's probably more widespread. And I'm saying to them, you probably speak with an accent that's closer to the Vikings, perhaps, or the Anglo-Saxons than you expect. And there's probably words that still remain in the language as well.
Oh, there's a lot. And particularly, I mean, I'm up in the Northwest myself. I'm not from here originally. So my accent is a real hybrid of all sorts of different areas. And I've picked up local words from, places where I've lived. But there's an idea that I think it's called the isoglot, isn't it? It's where the lines of language change and they shift. And I can't remember his surname, but he's a beautiful poet from Barnsley, Ian, I want to say Macmillan. Sorry if I've got that wrong. Did a brilliant, I think it was on Radio 4, explaining how, and forgive me for being vulgar here, I think it was called From House to Arse.
Right.
And he was explaining about how the word house changes as you cross from east to west or west to east, round about Derbyshire, so East Midlands. And because that is where you've got this major shift between where the Danes settled.
Is that the Danelaw?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So you've got totally different cultural influence.
Yeah.
There's that sort of diagonal line across the British Isles.
Yeah. And I mean, obviously that gives us the north-south divide. But interestingly, the Kingdom of Northumbria in Anglo-Saxon times went from east to west. So it was right across the top. But originally it was two kingdoms. And the southern portion was centred around York. And the northern portion was centred around Bamborough. And the Vikings or the Danes didn't really settle or conquer that northern portion. So they remain speaking English, essentially Anglo-Saxon, whereas the southern portion, which is now what we think of as Yorkshire, has probably a bit more of a Viking-influenced dialect. But you get all these differences, and they do go back to this period.
I think it's fascinating. It's really exciting. People living today, we're historical relics in a way. There are bits of the way we speak which go back hundreds, if not thousands of years. And I think we should all be proud of those regional eccentricities, differences, whatever you might want to call them, because they are part of our embedded and shared history in a beautiful way.
Well, I mean, one thing that you picked up when you said about the narrow lanes being gitties, that probably comes from gate Oye, which was the Viking name for a road, essentially.
Right.
And you get, lots of these gates in York. I mean, famously, Coppergate, which is the Cooper's Street, is where they were doing all the wood turning. And you get a lot of gates, particularly the nearest town to where I live. The main street that runs through it is called Highgate. And you don't get these in the south. But when you look at the place names, I mean, anywhere in the Danelaw and up, you get a lot of place names that end with by, which is the Viking place name ending,
Right.
as opposed to your tons and your hams and your ings, which are all Old English and Anglo-Saxon, and far more of those in the south and southwest where the Danes didn't conquer and settle.
And change the name of the place they were living.
And change the name, yeah.
Wonderful. Well, look, I've taken up more than enough of your time. It's absolutely fascinating. We could keep on chattering about this subject. If people want to follow your work, your book is Murder in Anglo-Saxon England. Where is that available?
It should be in all good bookshops. Obviously, it's available online. You can find me on my website, anniewhiteheadauthor.co.uk, and that's links to all my social media. You can find me there as well.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. That was really good fun. And what about your historical fiction as well?
Oh, yes. So I've got 4 novels. My first one was about Athelflaed, Lady of the Mercians. It's called To Be a Queen. That's the story of her life. And then I've got a couple, so far all my novels are set in Mercia, the Midlands Kingdom. A 2-book series about King Penda, famously the last pagan king, and that's called Cometh the Hour, and then there's a follow-up. But if you go to my website, all the details of all my work is there.
Thank you very much for chatting with me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
I've enjoyed it so much. Thank you.